Okay, we are now live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this first UK and a Changing Europe lunch hour of 2024. That's the first hurdle overcome successfully because I usually get the year wrong in January. It takes me a long time to adjust. We're here to discuss, this is known as the year of elections, and we're here to talk about three of the big elections that are going to be happening this year. What are the prospects? What might happen? What are the interlinkages? And with me, I have three fantastic panelists. Sara Hobolt from the LSE, the Sutherland Chair of European Institutions. Bill Galston from the Brookings Institution, where he's a senior fellow and holds the Ezra Z. Zilker Chair. And finally, our own Rob Ford. You see how we take ownership of you when you have money from UK and a Changing Europe. Rob Ford from the University of Manchester. And we're going to discuss the European, the US and the UK elections, all of which should happen. Well, two of which will happen, one of which probably will happen this year. And just to kick us off, and as ever, put your questions in Slido, vote for the questions you want me to put to the panelists. My New Year's resolution is to stop being such a rubbish chair and actually get to more questions than I usually do. So we'll see how I do. But the first question for all of you, I suppose, is in terms of the election that you're going to be looking at most closely, whether it be European, US or UK, what are the key things you think we should be looking out for? And despite your protest, Sara, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Anand, and Happy New Year. So, I said maybe don't start with the European elections because they're probably the ones that the fewest people have heard of or taken any interest in, but they are the ones that of the elections we're looking at here probably will happen first and also probably will be the biggest of the three in terms of voters, certainly in terms of voters who can vote. And they will take place in June this year, not all on the same day, but on the same week. And what will I be looking for? Well, these are elections for one of the main legislative chambers in the EU. And so they function like any other parliament. So I will be looking for the balance between the left and the right. So will we see that the EPP is still the biggest political force? That's the center right in the European, the Christian Democrats in the European Parliament. Will they remain the largest force? How big will the sort of grand coalition, which is between the center right, the center left, and the liberals, how big will that be in the next parliament? So that's the first thing I'll look at. The second thing I will look at is how well will the radical right do? There's two radical right-wing groupings in the European Parliament. So far, polls are suggesting they're going to do better. We've seen them doing well in a number of national elections, most recently in the Netherlands, before that in Italy and Slovakia. So they might well also do well in the European Parliament election. Just how well will be a question to look at. And finally, in the run-up to the election, I'll look at whether or not the big parties are putting forward so-called lead candidates or Spitzenkandidaten for the post of the European Commission president. So the European Commission president is the main executive player in the European Union. And if the major political parties, party groupings put forward their own candidates, that can also help determine the future of the EU's executive. So those will be the three things I'll be looking for.
Thanks, Sara. And just before I go to Bill, let's just get this out of the way now. There's far more to this election than whether the far right do well, which is all that commentators seem to be talking about, isn't it? I mean, this matters in substantive terms for how the EU is governed and the sort of policies that we might see from it over the next 5 years.
I mean, yes, the European Parliament today is really very much like we can think of House of Representatives in the US, in the sense that they are an equal co-legislator with the council. So they've really set the legislative and policy agenda. They're very important in terms of policy making in the EU, from everything ranging from what to do about Russia to what to do about climate change to migration and so on. They're a very important player. And the main political forces in the European Parliament are the main centrist political blocs, not the far right. They're the ones that tend to make the laws in the EU, and I think will continue to make the laws. So the balance between them and how well they do, that's the key thing in terms of the policy-making agenda going forward in the EU.
Wonderful, thank you. And Bill, thank you for doing this. Welcome. Your thoughts on what the key things are to look out for in the US election?
Well, first of all, Let me apologize for my poor Cheshire cat imitation. Uh, the video across the pond is not working well, or perhaps it's a Lord Grey reference. Uh, at any rate, uh, I have been voting in U.S. presidential elections since 1968. And I can say with confidence that the election coming up in 2024 will be the most important of my lifetime and the most important for all Americans who are casting votes. Uh, it will determine the course of the country and to a substantial extent, the course of the world. The nature of the U.S. alliance structure rides on the outcome of this election. I needn't go into details about what could change if Mr. Trump wins. I've had many conversations with European representatives suggesting that Europe will undergo a fundamental reevaluation if Mr. Trump is returned to office. So what I'm looking for first and foremost is who wins the election. And secondly, of course, in our system, which is not a parliamentary system, much depends on whether Mr. Trump, if he wins, would be able to carry a majority of both the House and the Senate with him. That's by no means a sure thing, especially in the House of Representatives. But if there were unified government under Mr. Trump's direction, there would be profound domestic changes, and as I just mentioned, profound foreign policy changes as well, with consequences for the world. I could go into the different factors that it seems to me will drive the election, but perhaps, unless I hear otherwise from the moderator, I should reserve those for a second round of questions.
That's excellent. Thank you. And actually, your emphasis on who wins is interesting, because in the questions we've got coming in, there are quite a few questions either suggesting, who cares who wins the UK election because the Tories and Labour are both the same? And equally, does it really matter who wins the European Parliament elections, because you'll end up with the same people in charge anyway, more or less? I mean, the difference in terms of the clear sort of split between the two parties in the US and the fact that the outcome really matters, and this sort of rather negative attitude you sometimes hear in Europe that, doesn't really matter either way is quite striking. We might get back to that. But Rob,
indeed,
last but not least.
Yeah, well, I mean, this British election, I think, is a really pivotal turning point election for Britain as well. I don't think the stakes are quite as global as is the case in the Washington elections this November, but it's clearly it could be only the third election of my lifetime where we see a decisive change of course in terms of government. Three things I'll be looking out for. Firstly, we enter this year with a kind of scenario of voters are deeply dissatisfied with the incumbent government, but say they're not really convinced about the opposition or aren't really sure what the opposition stands for. Now, I went back and looked through the history books on this, and that was exactly the same in 1997 and in 2010. It's not unusual for voters to have a stronger view about the incumbent than the opposition at this point, and doesn't necessarily mean a failure by the opposition to convince or win over the electorate. What it means is, until you get close to election day, voters think about politics primarily in terms of their view of the government. They only start thinking about it in terms of a choice as we get towards the moment of choice. So the first thing I'll be watching is, as voters start to think about this as a choice, who gains or loses from that shift in thinking. In 1997, they firmed up behind Tony Blair. They wanted that choice, they wanted that change. In 2010, they didn't really firm up behind David Cameron, and that was probably one of the factors behind the Nick Clegg surge in that election campaign. So that's one thing that I think Labour will be watching nervously. Will this support, this lead they have, firm up? Now, the second thing is, if voters don't firm up fully behind the main opposition, but they're unhappy with the government, will they go somewhere else? And the party I have in mind here, been in the discussion a lot this week in the news, is Reform UK. And the big thing I'm watching is, what will Nigel Farage do? Because an election campaign with Nigel Farage playing a major role will be a very different dynamic to an election campaign that doesn't feature Nigel Farage. With the best will in the world, Richard Tice isn't a figure of similar heft and stature and capacity to grab the spotlight. Then the third thing I'm going to be watching is the geography of the vote. Thanks to our first past the post electoral system, national vote shares are not really the decisive factor in terms of the outcome. It's all about where you get the votes. So I'll be watching in the local elections and in the by-elections whether or not we're seeing the kind of tactical voting we've seen recently, keeping a close eye on Scottish Labour's performance in Scotland, where they've been advancing majorly, and also keeping an eye on the performance of the Liberal Democrats in seats where they're in second place. So those are the three big things I'll be trying to keep an eye on as we get towards election day. Even if we have stability in the national polling like we have had for the last year, there could be change below the radar on some of these things.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Rob. Actually, Bill, while we're talking about sort of third parties, I just want to ask this question now so I don't forget later. What difference do you think a sort of third party candidate might make, or will it be completely superfluous in the US this time around?
Well, I think we need to talk about third, fourth, and fifth parties
Okay.
in 2024, because there will be at least three significant alternatives to the two major parties. And not to put too fine a point on it, their influence on the outcome could be decisive. In 2016, a left-wing party, the Green Party, polled more than enough votes in crucial swing states to snatch victory in those states from Hillary Clinton and turn them over to Donald Trump. Now, we do not know for sure that if there had been no third party in the race, that the results would have been reversed, but there's strong circumstantial evidence that would have been the case. This year, we have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's a real wild card. He's very hard to typecast politically, but the combination of his famous name plus some striking issue positions plus his inclination towards conspiracy theories, gives him some purchase with the electorate. An African-American intellectual by the name of Cornel West has, I think, some attraction to educated African Americans and also to young people who would have turned out enthusiastically for Bernie Sanders, but whose affection for Joe Biden, which was never intense, is waning. And then a group that I used to belong to before I split away from them in disagreement over a possible third party challenge, namely No Labels, is likely to mount a bipartisan candidacy. And then there is the Green Party, the same one that arguably snatched the election away from Hillary Clinton in 2016, prepared to run the same candidate again. So your question has opened, as we say, a real can of worms, and no analysis that focuses simply on the relative position of the two parties can be adequate in 2024.
Okay, that's fascinating. We will come back, obviously, to the two big parties in a bit. I'm keen to get through some of these questions. Again, questions flooding in, and do put your questions in Slido and do vote for the ones you want me to pose. And in a break with tradition, I'm going to pose them. So, Rob, the first one is for you. When do you think, or any of you want to chip in on this, when do you think the election is likely to happen? And does it make a material difference for either of the parties when it happens?
Well, I think the first point to make is that the logic points very strongly to as late as possible. The logic in question being turkeys don't vote for Christmas. A party that's trailing by 15 to 20 points in the polls is not going to go to the electorate early. I feel quite strongly that is the case. It's always been how it has panned out historically when other unpopular governments have been making this choice. You see occasionally arguments of, oh, well, if you go later, isn't that likely to make things worse? I don't think prime ministers and governments tend to think that way. They tend to think like Mr. McCorber. If we go later, then hopefully something might turn up. So I don't really buy, and have never bought, any of the arguments regarding May as an election date. It always struck me as a feint by the Conservatives because they wanted to increase uncertainty about their strategy, a feint by Labour because they wanted to get this narrative going of the Tories are chickening out of an election and hiding from the electorate. And as soon as that strategy did get some traction, we saw Rishi Sunak saying second half of the year, trying to maintain a little bit of ambiguity. But as soon as there's a successful Labour attack line on this, we get the retreat. Not surprised. I think therefore late autumn, because why not as late as possible, which would be January 2025, which would ruin the year of elections because we wouldn't be in that year anymore, because nobody wants to campaign over Christmas. It would make Rishi Sunak the most unpopular man ever within the Conservative Party if he made every single Conservative activist tramp through the streets in the Christmas and Boxing Day days. Imagine, an electorate that's already unhappy with the government having their Christmas turkey sport by a guy with a rosette at the door. Nobody's going to want that. So I don't think it'll go as late as January, because January requires, in terms of minimum election campaigning periods, campaign over Christmas. So therefore, I think October or November.
No, the counter argument is I've got January 25 in the office sweepstake, which got to count for something, surely, in terms of election timing. And what do you make of the argument? You hear this argument sometimes made that actually the Tories are going to do very badly in the local elections, partly because they're very unpopular, partly because of the places that are going to the polls this year. And they will lose a lot of activists and campaigners by virtue of the seats they lose in those elections. So going early might spare them a bit of damage. Do you think it makes a difference in that way?
I mean, that argument is one I've made myself in the past when debating the different election dates. And I think if the polls had narrowed in 2023, I was amongst many who thought that they might, then I would be thinking that's still a live option. If we were looking at a 10-point poll deficit rather than the 15 to 20-point poll deficit, then maybe you start thinking about May as a kind of damage limitation exercise. But I think given the scale of the polling deficit, the desire to have as much time as possible to cross your fingers and hope that things turn around just gets stronger. And of course, earlier governments have faced the same logic and have just accepted a pummeling in local elections rather than going and avoiding that. The other argument that gets made is, oh well, it could trigger a leadership challenge against Sunak. And I guess that, given the volatility of the Conservative Party, that can never be entirely ruled out. But I think right now we have a situation where we have an awful lot more Conservative MPs who agree that they're unhappy with the Prime Minister than would agree for any plausible alternative. So I think that will make a challenge hard to sustain.
So I suppose the key point is the interests of the party are different to the interests of the Prime Minister. And the Prime
Well,
Minister.
yeah, and the other thing in this, I think, which is worth mentioning, is that Rishi Sunak does seem to quite enjoy being Prime Minister. Most people who make it to the very top of the greasy pole, seem to like that. It's the goal of any politician to make it to the very top. So why would you cut short your tenure unnecessarily? If you know that defeat is coming, well, why not have another 6 months in the job?
Can I just say, incidentally, you can all feel free to chip in on different elections if you want. You don't have to feel like you're all siloed. So if you've got something to say about someone else's election, do chip in. But Sara, I've got one here for you, which is an interesting one, actually, because I never really thought about this. But do the European Parliament elections have any implications in terms of EU support for Ukraine and whether that will continue? Could they shape that in some way?
Yes, I mean, that is one of the concerns that are often raised when it comes to a stronger radical right grouping in the European Parliament, and of course also in the Council, because what we see, there is I should say here that the radical right in Europe is not as one on this. One interesting thing is we've seen Menon, who is Prime Minister of Italy, Brothers of Italy, actually has been very strong in her support for sanctions against Russia and support for Ukraine. But generally, when it comes to voices that are saying we shouldn't necessarily be sending so much financial support and so much military assistance to Ukraine, that does come from the radical. So there is a concern that it will be harder to pass legislative bills, potentially, with a stronger radical right. However, you could see this also being an area where the Grand Coalition that I briefly mentioned, which is a coalition that makes most of the bulk of legislation in the European Parliament and has done for a very, very long time, which is the Socialists and Democrats, the second largest centre-left grouping, the EPP, which is the largest centre-right grouping, and the Liberals that are in the middle. And what they share is a lot of their outlook in terms of the role of the European Union. They are pro-integration groupings, and they've also been shared an outlook in terms of that the EU should go in very early, very steadfast in terms of sanctions against Russia and support for Ukraine. The prognosis so far is they would still have a majority, and that they would probably use that in cases such as on this. But if they didn't have a majority, then the radical right here could be consequential.
Okay, brilliant. I'll come back to you in a minute. There's quite a few policy questions about the European elections. But Bill, I want to come back to you, partly because I've got an interesting question from Stephen in our office, who for some reason won't use Slido, but is WhatsApping me, which is confusing me. But anyway, which is about, the same thing was said in 2020. This is a once-in-a-generation election. Are Americans getting bored of being told that this is once in a generation? And whilst, professional election watchers might think this, what are your feelings about turnout and whether Americans really feel this election is as pivotal as you said it was?
Good question. My crystal ball, as always, is cloudy, but my like sense, tell me about it. But my sense is that this will be another high turnout election. I say that because the right is angry and the left is fearful. And in this, anger, of course, is a mobilizer. Fear can go either way, but I think in this case, fear will drive a lot of Democrats and Democratic leading independents to the polls because they're not pretending. They are genuinely worried that the future of American democratic institutions could be riding on the outcome of this election. There was a huge outpouring in 2020, and you might see a little drop off, but I don't think it's going to be back to 2016 levels or 2012 levels.
And just because I don't know this off the top of my head, what was turnout last time?
The turnout last time was in the mid 60s, which is very high by American standards, though low by the standards of the civilized world. And it meant that up more than 150 million votes were cast, really for the first time ever.
Right.
And it stunned even seasoned poll watchers.
Okay. And are you relatively confident that this is going to be a Biden-Trump election?
Unless one or the other, unless Mr. Biden has a disqualifying health event or Mr. Trump has a disqualifying legal event. But it's not clear to me in the latter case what would disqualify him in a court of law, because his supporters have been willing to stomach anything.
Okay. And just one more for you. I'm sorry to pick on you, Bill, but while I've got you.
That's okay. Well, I'm here.
You hear a lot from the Democrats. You saw that speech from President Biden, I think, last week about how this election is essentially a battle for democracy, and democracy would be under threat should Donald Trump win the election. How much cut through do you think that has with ordinary Americans, swing voters? That's to say, I sometimes get the sense that amongst Democratic elites, this is a genuine fear for the future of American democracy. Amongst undecided voters, it might seem a bit less so, and they might like to talk a little bit more about bread and butter issues rather than these rather grand concepts about the future of democracy. Do you think there's any truth in that?
There is some truth in that. And certainly people are more concerned about inflation, about immigration, and about what they see as a rising tide of crime, even though the national statistics don't bear out that concern. But as I look at the polls, democracy is by no means a trivial consideration. However, it scores high in both political parties. Okay. Because Mr. Trump has convinced his supporters and some people who may turn out to be his supporters that it is Joe Biden and the Democrats who are a threat to democracy. And they use as Exhibit A the alleged weaponization of the legal system against conservatives, starting with Mr. Trump, extending to the participants in the January 6th event, whatever you want to call it, and there's no neutral term for it, and then extending to people in the states who collaborated with Mr. Trump in an effort to create false slates of electors. So the Republicans in many cases are just as concerned about how they define democracy as Democrats are about how they define it.
Okay, interesting. Sarah, interesting one for you, which is, do you think sort of current geopolitical tensions and uncertainties might increase turnout in the European Parliament elections? That's to say, a moment of profound instability. Do you think that will drive more people to vote in these elections than would normally be the case? Impossible question to answer, I know, but that's the fun of it.
Well, I guess the thing about turnout, so we just heard that the US turnout is the lowest in the civilized world. Of course, turnout in European Parliament elections is even lower. That doesn't mean that, because it's substantially lower than it is in national general elections, so legislative national elections and presidential elections. So what happened was we started off with a turnout around 62% back in the very first elections to the European Parliament in 1979. It then declined in every successive election, and last time, so it was all the way down to sort of 42%. Last time it went up a bit, and the European Parliament is very much hoping that this was not a one-off, but that we will see turnout above 50% this time. But that's the kind of region we're talking in, like, and so turnout is not high in European Parliament elections. So there's a lot of potential for having higher turnout for people to take an interest. Now, why is turnout not high? I mean, a key reason is that people, I think, don't really understand what the European Parliament elections are. Indeed, in terms of these big geopolitical questions, what difference will it make what I and how I vote in European Parliament elections? And we heard very eloquently about, we can understand what is at stake in the US elections. I think we can understand what is at stake in the British election. It's, are we going to have more conservative government? Are we going to have a Labour government? It's very clear. Now, there is not a clear link between European Parliament election and a new government, a new head of state, a new head of government. And that means that while the European Parliament has a huge impact on the kind of policies we see in Europe, it doesn't lead to this sort of personalized change in personnel at the very top. And certainly not as directly as in American and British elections. So that just means that turnout is generally low. And it's very much shaped by kind of whatever national political dynamics you have in each of the different 27 national contests. So will turnout go up? I mean, it's likely, because it's from a very low point, as I said, of just less than half of the electorate. But there is still, the European Parliament still does suffer from this fundamental problem that that people don't really fully understand the link between the policies and what happens in the European Union and their vote in European Parliament elections.
Wonderful, thank you. And Rob, actually, we've got a question from Bridget Fowler. Happy New Year, Bridget, asking what your expectations are for turnout in the UK and what different. I mean, does it favour one side if it's high? Does it favour one side if it's low? And what do you think it will be? No pressure.
Oof, it's a tricky one, really, because I think it can be argued either way. On the one hand, relative to 20, we've had like a somewhat rising trend in turnout since the sort of low ebb in 2001. In the last couple of elections, there's been a kind of upward pressure from voters who cared an awful lot about the EU and Brexit issue. Were turning out to register their views on that. That's not on the agenda now, and might push turnout a little bit down. But on the other hand, everybody knows that this is an election that could well result in a change of government. That might push turnout up a bit. But on the third hand, if the polling doesn't change from where it is now, then this looks like an election which is a bit of a foregone conclusion. So in 1997, which is the last election we really had like that, turnout was down somewhat on 1992. I suspect, given that the election doesn't look close, given that we don't have Brexit on the agenda, given that enthusiasm for Starmer and his project is not overwhelmingly high in the way that it was for Blair, balance of evidence suggests to me that turnout might fall a few percentage points. I suspect that won't really matter one way or the other in partisan terms, because I suspect most of the fall will come in relatively safe seats. I think we'll see much higher turnout in seats that have the potential to change hands, both because the parties will concentrate on those seats and also because we've seen a really strong kind of negative partisan dynamic kick in the past few years. Voters who have an opportunity to kick out a representative of an unpopular incumbent government are exercising that opportunity with relish. So I think in any seat where there's a potential to do that, we'll see pretty high turnout, and much of the staying at home will probably happen either in safe Conservative seats where disgruntled Tory voters will just sit it out, or safe Labour seats where, for example, voters more on the progressive left of the spectrum who aren't very much enamoured of the Starmer project may well just sit the election out in protest about that. But in neither case will that make much of an impact on the outcome.
I have to say,
I'm sorry, before we end this segment on turnout, I should just issue a clarification. First of all, that when I was talking about turnout levels, I was talking about national elections and not turnout for Europe-wide elections, about which I know next to nothing, shamefully. And secondly, my reference to the civilized world was in current circumstances grimly ironic and not to be taken seriously.
No one's going to get offended, Bill. Not on our panels. Don't worry about it. I have to say, one of the things on my life bucket list is to live in a marginal seat, is to live and vote in a marginal seat. I've always voted in appallingly safe seats, and I would like just one. So I never get election leaflets.
I've lived in several marginal seats. It's great.
Yeah.
You get so much literature.
Come and live where I live in Wimbledon. It's three-way marginal. It's very exciting all year round.
You see, I envy you that. Now what we're going to do is some live comparative political science now, because we're going to think about a couple of issues that are going to matter in all these elections and try and see how they will matter in different ways. Now, Bill mentioned immigration. Now, immigration, one way or another, is going to be an issue in all three of these elections. And the interesting ways is whether it matters in the same way, whether it divides people in the same way, whether it's weaponized in the same way across these. So I'm going to start with you, actually, Rob, and just immigration is going to be one of the key issues in this election, isn't it? How do you think it will play out?
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's come right back onto the agenda in the past 18 months or so, and there's kind of a few obvious reasons for that. The overall numbers are very high, they're record levels. We've had the small boats issue, which has attracted a great deal of media attention, and we've seen a sustained Conservative campaign on it. Stop the boats being one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges. We've had months and months of parliamentary wrangling over the Rwanda scheme, over the illegal migration bill, and so on and so forth. So this has been, a period where either intentionally or unintentionally, the Conservatives have been very, very strongly associated with arguments over immigration control. Now, how will it play out? I think it will play out rather differently to in past elections for a few reasons. Firstly, overall attitudes to immigration are still, despite the recent controversy, substantially more positive than they were in earlier periods. If you take 97, the last election where there was potential for a switch from a Conservative to a Labour government, immigration was much less salient in 1997, but the share of voters who said immigration was too high was higher than it is now, even though immigration was much lower at that point. If we look at many other measures of immigration, the public views about the impact of immigration on society in the 2000s, the early 2010s, much more negative than now. Secondly, we know it's back on the agenda. You use the Ipsos Mori data, you can see a quarter of voters are now saying it's a top issue. But the partisan divide on that is absolutely stark. And that's completely new. It was not the case in 2010 or 2005 or 2001. It's now the number one issue for Conservative voters, but it's not even in the top 5 for Labour voters. So it's like you're talking to 2 completely different audiences. So as a strategy potentially for consolidating their side of the electorate, it makes sense for the Conservatives. But as a strategy for winning back swing voters who are going over to Labour, it makes much less sense. But then the third thing is, it doesn't work as a strategy for consolidating Conservative voters either, because the other thing that's changed about the opinion on immigration is that the public is overwhelmingly negative about the government's performance on it and doesn't believe the policies on Rwanda or the promises on Stop the Boats at all. It's one thing to say we're going to stop the boats and get voters to believe you. Then that's a compelling campaign issue. If you say stop the boats and everyone laughs at you and says, well, that's never going to happen, mate, then all you're doing is handing a potent issue to parties to your right who aren't in government, won't be judged in the same way, and can say, they keep saying they're going to do this, but they keep failing. Vote for us, we will do it. Or vote for us to illustrate how annoyed you are about the fact that they keep saying they'll do it and don't. So it's just a very different dynamic to in the past, I think. You're muted, I think.
You're muted, Anand.
That was another New Year's resolution bites the dust early in the year. I'm going to come to you last, Bill, on this, if I may, because that what Rob was just saying about how sort of centrist parties sort of weaponizing immigration might play into the hands of the far right. That is one of the dynamics we might see in the European Parliament elections, isn't it, Sara? And anything else that Rob said that sort of chimes with what you're thinking about in the EU elections, just go ahead.
Yeah, there's some clear parallels and I think a couple of differences to the British context. So in Europe, immigration is also, a very important issue and one that has increased in salience. And we've seen that most recently in the Dutch election where Wilders' Freedom Party came out as the largest party. We also see that as a key driving force behind the rise of the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, that is doing very well in the polls. And that's highly correlated with people concerned about immigration. And generally, if we look over the last couple of decades of European politics and the rise of the populist and radical right, immigration is both a key campaigning topic of these parties being tough on immigration and also a key concern for their voters. There is then the question that Rob alluded to in terms of what does the mainstream right do? Do they say, oh, we're also going to go tough on immigration, or do they sort of talk about something else? Clearly in Britain, they've said, oh, we're also going to go tougher. We're going to go as tough. And in Europe, there's at the EU level been some attempts of sort of trying to get ahead of it in advance of the European Parliament election, trying to sort of strengthen external borders. I don't think that will mean that people who are very concerned about immigration will therefore think, oh, we don't have to now vote for the radical right. But that's the hope of the sort of mainstream political groupings. Now, I think a key difference between the sort of continental European and the British context is that the concerns are not, there's not generally great concerns about intra-European integration. So we know in the Brexit debate that one of the campaigns on the Leave side was we can stop immigrants from Europe coming in. Now that is actually not as much of a concern or a campaigning point for the radical right in the continental Europe. It's really immigrants coming from outside. And a lot of the concern of these parties have been really also about anti-Muslim migration. If you look at Wilders' track record, it's very much not one about immigrants coming from Europe, but really immigrants coming from outside. Another interesting sort of footnote to this whole debate on immigration is really also how Europeans have welcomed with very open arms refugees coming from Ukraine, really without questioning, and it really not being politicized in that sense. It's been very quick and swift in legislative terms in terms of having special routes for Ukrainians to come in to the rest of Europe, and also of course now have started the process of Ukraine being a candidate state. So again, yes, there are concerns about migration, but it's not all forms of a migration when it comes to the European debate.
Muted again.
No, I wasn't. I was deliberately trying to get rid of a phone call and failing. Okay. So that was a complete cock up. But Bill, over to you. What are your reflections based on what the other two have said and what's happening in the US on immigration?
Well, when Rob started talking, I thought he was speaking about the United States, because the parallels are uncanny. In 2016, immigration was the top Republican issue. You know, the analysts I trust the most suggest that it was the issue that propelled Donald Trump into the presidency. And the Democrats did not really care about the issue. 8 years later, nothing has changed. It is close to the top issue for Republicans and may turn out to be the top issue during the campaign. It is a passionately felt issue. It does not divide the Republican Party. It does divide the Democratic Party into the pragmatists and the idealists, because the idealists are genuine humanitarians. I won't go so far as to say they believe in open borders, but but they reject anything that would tend to close them, which gives the color of plausibility to the charge of the right that they really are in favor of open borders. It has been a catastrophically mismanaged issue on the part of the Biden administration, a realization to which they've come to late and reluctantly. But now, as you may know, the fat is really in the fire, because key elements of Mr. Biden's foreign policy, aid to Ukraine, aid to Israel, aid to Ukraine, are being held hostage to fundamental changes in the structure, not just the administration, not just the funding, but the basic structure of immigration law. Now, I'd say it's at best 50-50 that the two parties which have been negotiating behind the scenes now for more than a month are going to be able to get to yes on that issue. Even if they do in the Senate, it will be an even more divisive issue in the House of Representatives, and it is quite possible that the hard right will reject any and all immigration compromises and insist on their maximalist program, which they laid out and enacted early in 2023 and sent over to the Senate, which of course does not like it. So it could, to sum up, turn out to be the decisive issue in the 2024 presidential election. And Mr. Trump has already laid out his agenda for, in effect, closing the borders if he becomes president. And I have confidence that he would execute that agenda if he had the power to do so.
I might add one line in footnote to what Bill said, which is, if you were to take the line, the hard right in the lower chamber of Parliament may insist on a maximalist agenda and reject any compromise on immigration, thus pushing forward legislation that has no hope of passage in the upper chamber. You could say that without changing a word to describe the exact situation we're in Britain right now, with the migration bill, the Rwanda legislation, and so on. The Tory hard right are behaving very much like the Republican hard right. They aren't interested in compromise, and they aren't interested in the political realities of the situation. And that's another major headache for Rishi Sunak going into this election campaign, because how on earth can he run on an anti-immigration general election campaign if he can't even get his flagship piece of legislation through Parliament before we go to the voters? And at present, it seems like a number of his MPs would rather sink it than compromise.
I have to say, I'm very excited about the comparative blog that Bill and Rob are very nearly offering to write for us on this. But anyway, Sara, just turning to you quickly, we've got a few questions on, I don't want to get too into the weeds about this, about whether these elections, these European elections, are particularly important given what Charles Michel has decided to do. And given the fact that we might go into a Hungarian presidency without a presidency of the council, does that matter at all? 2 or 3 people have asked the question, and I just don't know, but I thought I'd ask you.
Well, I don't think, it matters a bit in the short term, but I don't think it necessarily makes a big difference for the European Parliament election. So I think I have to give a bit of institutional context to what this means, and I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. So you have a leader, we have 2 executive bodies in the European Union. We have the Council, which is where the member states sit, and they have a permanent presidency, who is Charles Michel, who's saying he now wants to stand down early and run in the European Parliament election. You also have another executive body, which is the Commission, which is headed by Ursula von der Leyen. Now, in terms of the Council, we also, in addition to having the permanent president, we also have a rotating presidency that goes every 6 months between member states. Now, that role becomes more important if there's no permanent presidency, in other words, and the next one in line is Hungary, which is led by the bad guy, so to speak, of the European Council, namely Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary. And so there's some concerns, or how will that work? But ultimately, this is a club of member states. We have more important member states than Hungary. It doesn't give him any particular, other than chairing the council, it doesn't give him any particular executive power. You're still going to have France and Germany and Italy sitting there. So I'm not sort of, there are some people who think it wasn't particularly strategic of Michel in terms of thinking about the European Union, and it might create some issues around just the sort of, like it matters who chairs any meeting, but that's really the long and short of it. So I don't think it sort of fundamentally alters the long-term prospects of what happens after the European Parliament. But that's the kind of institutional rankling that's going on.
Well, as we said in the UK case, individual interest might be different to institutional interest in some of these.
Yeah, so he's clearly hoping to get something out of it.
Yeah.
What exactly, we'll wait and see.
Now, a general question to all of you, which is how worried should we be about disinformation given the prominence of social media, the rise of AI, which I barely understand, so you can explain that to me while you go. But is disinformation going to be more of a problem in these elections than it has been in the past, and should we be worried about it?
I mean, I can sort of kick off generally, just to say that, I mean, I think it's definitely should be a concern, and particularly, for example, in the European case, disinformation coming from Russia. So what we know, that Russia has an interest in destabilizing the West, and in particular destabilizing any country, and that's of course the US, Britain, and the EU alliance that's helping Ukraine. And so any tendency, anything that makes it look like we don't have our own house in order, anything that makes people question the elections, and that's, of course, maybe the European Parliament elections are the least salient of the three we're discussing. But of course, AI has meant that spreading disinformation has become a lot easier and more effective just with the technological advances, and that has a lot of potential negative consequences. And I know it's something in a European context that they're looking very closely at, and are quite concerned about running in the lead up to the elections.
Rob or Bill?
I'm going to take a contrarian view on this issue, and a situated contrarian view, and let me explain that sentence. In normal U.S. presidential elections involving an incumbent president, the incumbent, his leadership qualities, his program, and particularly the consequences of his administration, that's issue one. And everything else pales by comparison. And after 3 or 3.5 years, people have a pretty good sense of all of those things based on experience. In those circumstances, the impact of disinformation is likely to be asymmetrical. That is, focused on the challenger, who is less well known and whose public image and reputation is therefore much more malleable and, in a sense, much more vulnerable. 2024 will be completely different, because for the first time in more than 150 years, the incumbent president will be facing the former president whom he defeated in the previous election. These are two extraordinarily well-known gentlemen competing against each other. In those circumstances, I think disinformation is likely to have less of an impact than it would if one of the candidates were relatively unknown. So that's point number one. Point number two is that I think the largest impact of disinformation has already been felt, because the candidate who lost the election has persuaded the overwhelming majority of his party that he actually won it. Right? This is the most successful disinformation campaign in American political history. How much more damage can be done? I think just at the margin. So yeah, I mean, I've written papers about the impact of deep fakes, the ability to put words in candidates' mouths in their own voices, words that they never uttered. I continue to worry about that but the words that could be put in Mr. Trump's mouth by some opponent cannot be any more striking than the words that he utters sua sponte. So all of these things make me a skeptic about the impact of disinformation in 2024.
Interesting. Rob?
I think I am also, to some extent, skeptical that it's going to have a big impact in Britain. I mean, I should say, number one, I find the deepfake stuff very alarming. I was in the cinema recently with my son, and they were doing an advert for a mobile phone company showing how at the touch of a button you could edit the picture, the sound, everything about the thing you've done on your own phone to create something that's entirely fictional. And I'm thinking they're celebrating this in an advert in a cinema. What are the implications for democracy that you can just do that in 2 minutes? It's terrifying. And secondly, unlike in America, we have two lead candidates, neither of whom participated in the last election. So here we have a low information baseline. So why am I still sanguine despite both of those things? I think because I see the influence of disinformation as reinforcing existing opinion rather than changing minds. I think it is a powerful force for polarization. But I think you often hear the sort of anecdote's not quite the right word, the heuristic that, when people want to believe something, they'll look for one reason to believe it. When people want not to believe something, they'll look for one reason not to believe it. So if people were to see misinformation that cut wholly against their image of Starmer or Sunak, they might question it. If it reinforces what they already thought, they won't. So I think that's one reason to be skeptical in general. And the second reason is misinformation is, to some extent, I feel, as a kind of cynical observer of British politics, rather than new wine in old bottles. It's not like it's new for the media in this country to present things in a highly partisan way. We've had a highly partisan press for as long as we've had a printing press. It's 3 or 4 election cycles ago that the way in which the leader of the opposition ate a bacon sandwich was apparently a major and pivotal and important issue that we should all care about. Maybe we'll have an invented image of Keir Starmer eating a bacon sandwich, but will that make it any more impactful? I'm not really certain. So I think ultimately it is a worry, and it probably will contribute to polarization. But is it the kind of thing that can actually turn around the dynamic in an election which has such a strong pattern currently in all the polls? I'm not sure. I doubt it.
I was struck at the end of last year by a report I read that claimed that the Five Eyes intelligence group had issued a bit of a warning about the dangers of US and UK elections being held at the same time, because this would make sort of security monitoring of what went on more difficult. So I mean, I'm so technologically ignorant, I don't know what that means, but I did.
I mean, it may reduce the impact of misinformation in the British election, because practically every malign actor that wants to flood the field with misinformation can be a lot more interested in doing it in the US than they are in the UK.
Yeah.
We've only got limited resources, so maybe that'll mean the eyes are taken off our election.
No, that's true. I mean, and this is, I suppose, this is the direction it works. It's specifically for you, Rob. But if the two elections were close, do you see any ways in which the US election might feed into the UK one or impact on it?
I think there are a couple of ways. I mean, one is it will disrupt the party's communications and grids, because let's face it, Donald Trump is a news generation machine. Every other day he'll say something outrageous or ridiculous, and that will then lead the news. In an election campaign where the parties are really going to be seeking to get their messages on the front pages and get their key talking points at the top of the agenda, that's going to be a standing problem if we're in the final stages of a US election. The second thing is it may well impact on the resources available to the parties, and I think in particular to the Conservative Party, because industries like polling, like election strategy and so on, these are globalized industries, and a lot of people, I mean, the US is the biggest money hoover for election campaigns. So a lot of talented people working on elections will probably be getting much better offers from across the Atlantic than can be offered in Britain. The Conservatives are probably most exposed to that because they're the most prone to use global talent in that way. So I think there's the Trump problem, which is going to potentially always disrupt the news agenda, and there's the kind of labour shortage problem, which is a lot of people who want to work on elections. They're going to have a much bigger payday in Washington than they will in London.
Though, of course, Labour Party have used Democratic strategists in the past and elections as well, haven't they?
Yeah,
it's really
that's true.
interesting. Sara, a very specific one for you, just worth talking about, is what the potential impact of these elections might be on the EU's Green Deal. We've seen the centre-right sort of shifting a little bit on this, I think, over the last few months. But how big are the implications for the EU's green credentials of the outcome of this election?
Again, that's one of the concerns that's often raised if it comes to the two radical right or conservative and radical right groups, the ECR and the ID. If they do better, they are two groups that are both, when it certainly comes to the sort of national constituent parties, much more critical of any efforts in terms of combating climate change. They're not necessarily climate change deniers, they just don't think the sort of money should be spent on it. We see that, for example, in Builders' campaign, we'll just build bigger dams. I mean, it's fine. And so that's something that some of the research I've done that really shows that when it comes to a very adversarial position on the responses to climate change, that's otherwise in Europe been a very consensual issue where the left and the right were in agreement largely, you really see the radical right taking a very different position and also campaigning on it, a bit like we've seen with Reform UK, sort of Richard Tice, it's not net zero, it's net stupid. That's a very similar thing we see across Europe in terms of the radical right. Now, the big question then becomes, if they do better, will the Grand Coalition that I've referred to several times, which is the one that's implemented a very legislative, a very ambitious Green Deal, will they start working? Will the centre-right start working with the radical right rather than working across the centre with the centre-left? So far, we've not seen that. So far, it's really the Grand Coalition that's been driving through that. And if, as the polls suggest, we'll still have a majority of the Grand Coalition in the next Parliament, then the Green Deal, and from that perspective, could be safe. But of course, if the centre-right decides to vote together with the radical right, then you could see the Green Deal being in jeopardy.
Okay, thank you. Just we're getting close to the end now, but there's one question. I'm not sure what the answer is. Question from Omar Hamid. Could elections in other parts of the world, such as India or Taiwan, have any impact on the elections we're talking about? I mean, obviously, the US one is huge, but are there any links we can draw with all these other elections with what's happening here, or maybe not?
I mean, there have just been an election in Bangladesh, and there are elections coming in India and Pakistan, and that's three of the largest national origin groups for Britain's ever-growing BAME communities. I think we do see evidence that the politics of South Asia does, influence conversations in this country. We've seen that on a number of occasions. We've seen, for example, George Galloway campaigning a lot on the Kashmir issue.
Yep.
We've seen issues to do with Modi appearing in London local elections. So this could be one of those fly under the radar type stories, in that the parties may well be looking to take positions on these elections in reaction to the kinds of concerns that are circulating in big ethnically diverse seats. It's going to be very hard to pick up in national polling, though, because we just don't have good enough fine-grained data on ethnic minority groups to be able to sort of track that during the general election campaign. But I think it could have the potential to deliver some surprise results in very diverse seats.
But we will do soon. Look out for our report coming out in about April on ethnic minority voters, Rob. Sorry, Bill.
The election I'm focused on the most is the Indian election, and that for two reasons. First of all, Mr. Modi has become part of the general swing towards populism narrative that shapes coverage, elite coverage of the election in the United States, and the impact of the Indian election in 2024 will not be nearly as large as the impact of Brexit in 2016, but it will be, I think, significant in no small measure because the Indian American population in the United States has grown enormously in the past half century as the result of changes in U.S. immigration policy. It has become a highly prosperous and increasingly politically influential group in the United States, and it is passionately pro-Modi. And so there could be what you folks call a knock-on effect for Indian American political participation in the U.S. presidential election. Have I done a fine-grained analysis of where that community might turn out to be decisive? No, but I will bet you sight unseen, given the millions now of prosperous, highly accomplished and influential locally Indian Americans, that it will be significant.
That's interesting. I mean, I went to Wembley just out of interest when Modi was here, and the number of sort of professional Indians who you sort of guess would probably be Labour Party supporters, certainly sort of left-wing liberal types, who were going bonkers at the sight of Modi on the stage, was really quite strange. So that sort of disconnect between the politics that Modi stands for and the politics these people might support here was interesting. But Sara, last word to you. Do you think any of these?
I mean, I think in terms of elections that the Europeans are looking to, obviously the Americans and the big one, and really also because it completely, as we very started off in terms of the global consequence of that, but also the consequence for Europe in terms of what should Europe's role be in the world if they no longer have a president that believes in the sort of global liberal world order. That is just completely different. If Trump wins again, that could just mean that Europe the EU has to rethink its own place in the world very drastically. So yes, at the margins, Britain might matter, at the margins, India might matter, but what really matters, of course, to all of us, and certainly to how Europe looks at itself and its role globally, is the American elections.
Okay, Sara has saved you, because I was planning to ask you all for predictions for your election, but we've run out of time, so I can't now. But let me just end by saying, Sara, Rob, Bill, thank you ever so much. I thought that was fascinating. We should have scheduled a couple of hours for it. In fact, I'm quite tempted to suggest that we do it again later in the year, or maybe after the elections, that we look back, because I think there's some really, really interesting insights there. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for watching. Look out for our next lunch hour, which I think is on 2 weeks' time, which is a really good panel on 4 years, is it now, since Brexit, on the 23rd of Jan. And we have a big conference on the 31st of Jan, online and in person, on the state of the UK economy. But for the moment, thank you all. Take care. Happy New Year, and see you all soon. All the best. Bye-bye.